Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning. Story 1. The Roman Seeds, Christianity before the Anglo-Saxons. You are in Roman Britain. The year is somewhere between 200 and 300 CE, a time of decline, quiet, creeping, but not yet total collapse. The Roman legions still man their forts, the roads still carry traders, soldiers, and messengers, but the edges of empire are beginning to fray. Among the tiled villas and administrative towns, far from the heart of the empire, Christianity begins to whisper, not loudly, not in churches with bells, not in stained glass or Latin chants echoing through cathedrals. No, it begins in households, in whispers, in signs traced in fish shapes on doors, in gatherings at twilight where scripture is read not aloud but in hushed voices. Christianity in Roman Britain was not yet a power, it was a question, a curiosity, and often a risk. Roman life and local resistance. The Roman way of life, imposed but gradually adopted in parts of Britain, brought towns, coins, temples, and baths. But local beliefs, worship of river spirits, tree gods, and ancestral deities persisted. In places like Bath, native goddesses were simply merged with Roman ones. The culture, like the roads, was layered. This meant that when Christianity arrived, it encountered not just Roman polytheism, but also deep-rooted Celtic traditions. What we know about early Christians in Britain is fragmentary. There are no great texts, no sweeping declarations, but we find traces. A Cairo symbol scratched into a wall in a Roman villa in Lullingstone, Kent. A ring with a Christian inscription buried in a grave, subtle and often overlooked. And this is what makes the period so curious. How did something so new, so fragile, begin to survive on such unstable ground? The quiet spread. The first evidence of Christians in Britain appears during the 3rd century. These were likely small communities, isolated and often secretive. Persecutions under emperors like Decius and Diocletian meant believers could not be too open. Churches were rare. Worship happened in homes or hidden spaces. The Roman administration likely tolerated Christian gatherings until it didn't. There is a documented martyrdom in Britain, St. Alban. His story, told later by Bede, is colored with legend. A Roman citizen who sheltered a priest, switched clothes with him, and was executed in his place. Whether true in every detail or not, it suggests the presence of organized belief, bravery, and opposition. But Alban's execution is important for another reason. It hints at conflict not between peoples, but between ideas. Rome allowed many gods, but Christianity insisted on only one, and this exclusivity was, politically, a problem. Everyday converts. But what kind of people converted? Not kings or governors, at least not at first. Likely merchants, freedmen, perhaps Romanized Britons with access to the broader empire. Christianity's early spread was deeply tied to urban networks and trade. Soldiers may have brought it. Slaves, too. Faith moved with people, and in the vast Roman system, people moved often. You can imagine a small house in Londinium, the fire low, and a few gathered to hear readings in Latin from the Gospel of Matthew. Outside, a patrol walks past. A child cries. Somewhere, a neighbor is singing to a pagan deity. But inside, the words feel new, different. A call to a kingdom not of this world. It is in these moments that the future faith of a nation quietly germinates. Conflict within. Yet Christianity did not spread easily or without internal disagreement. Even within the empire, questions abounded. What books are truly scripture? Who speaks with authority? What rituals matter most? In far-off Britain, these debates became even more muddled. Without strong clerical presence, beliefs likely mixed with local custom. It wasn't pure Rome or pure Judea, it was something else. Some Christian communities likely adopted local festivals, repurposing them. Others remained purist. Without the later structure of bishoprics and councils, early British Christianity was a mosaic, beautiful but inconsistent. And this inconsistency would become a point of tension later, when missionaries arrived with more formalized Roman doctrine. Imperial shifts. The fortunes of Christianity changed dramatically in the early 4th century. With Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan in 313, Christianity was no longer persecuted, it was permitted. Eventually, it became privileged. Churches began to be built openly. Clergy gained influence. Britain, still under Roman rule, felt this change. We find evidence of churches being constructed, bishops being appointed. The Council of Arles in 314 records the presence of British bishops. Names like Restitutus of London, Adelphius of Lincoln, and Eborius of York are listed. These names mark a subtle shift. Faith now had structure. But even this stability was fleeting. The withdrawal of Rome. By 410, Rome had officially pulled back. The legions left. The infrastructure, roads, towns, aqueducts began to decay. Trade diminished, and with it, the fragile Christian communities faced a new test. No longer protected by the empire and surrounded by unrest, Christianity began to recede. Pagan warlords gained power. Local customs reasserted dominance. The Germanic tribes Angles, Saxons, Jutes arrived, bringing their gods with them. And so Christianity became memory, not erased but diminished. Monuments were abandoned. Churches fell to ruin. The cross gave way again to the sword and the spear. And yet, even in this twilight, something remained. A memory, a story passed down, a ring, a scratched symbol on a wall. A question lingered, quiet but unresolved. What happens to a faith when its protectors disappear? And will it ever return to the island it once barely touched? By the beginning of the 5th century, the Roman Empire's grip on Britain had weakened beyond repair. Once an arm of a vast and ordered machine, the island was now a frontier left to its own devices. Roman officials withdrew, the army followed, and with them, the fragile political and economic order that had long supported urban life in Britain collapsed. And with that collapse, Christianity faced an uncertain fate. The fragility of faith without an empire. Christianity had never been dominant in Roman Britain, not in the way that it would be centuries later. It had coexisted with other belief systems, occasionally rising in visibility, but always limited by geography, literacy, and access to power. The sudden removal of Roman infrastructure, governance, protection, trade left these Christian communities vulnerable. There were no longer bishops attending councils in Gaul, no flow of coin to support clerics, no Roman road patrols to safeguard travel between congregations. Without the imperial engine behind it, Christianity had to stand on its own. It was not prepared to do so. Where once there had been quiet gatherings in villas or modest stone churches, now there were ruins. Without protection, these places were targets of theft, destruction, or simple abandonment. The rise of the pagan overlords. The vacuum of Roman power was quickly filled by tribal kings and warlords. Many were Romano-British, but many more were pagan newcomers, Angles, Saxons, Jutes. They came first as raiders, later as settlers. Their gods were warlike, their cosmology cyclical, their world divided between warriors and fate. Christianity was foreign to them. Its teachings of meekness, humility, and peace ran counter to a culture of strength, oath, and blood price. The cross was not a symbol of power, it was a symbol of defeat. And so, the Christian communities, already isolated and weakened, found themselves increasingly surrounded by those who saw their faith not just as alien, but as foolish. In places like Kent and Sussex, newly arrived Saxon kings established strongholds. The old Roman towns, once centers of administration and Christian life, were depopulated. Londinium was nearly abandoned. Verulamium, home of St. Alban's martyrdom, lay quiet. The faith flickered in a growing darkness. The Celtic Church in the west. But not all was lost. In the western reaches of the island Wales, Cornwall, Cumbria, Christianity survived. Isolated from Saxon influence and closer to the Irish Sea, these regions maintained connections with Ireland, Gaul, and even the remnants of Roman influence on the continent. The Celtic Church that formed here would prove vital in later centuries. This version of Christianity was distinct. It was shaped by isolation, oral tradition, and monasticism. There were no grand cities or cathedrals, but rather clusters of monks in stone huts. Worship took place in windswept glens on rocky coasts and in wooden chapels surrounded by cattle and fields. Clerical roles blurred with tribal leadership. Abbots often held more influence than bishops. The rule of life was stricter, more ascetic. Fasting, prayer, and manual labor defined these communities. The missionary impulse was strong, too. Irish monks would later carry Christianity back into the Anglo-Saxon world from these remote corners. Remnants in stone and memory. Even in the eastern parts of Britain, where the Saxons held power, hints of Christianity did not entirely vanish. Archaeologists have uncovered Christian artifacts buried in 5th and 6th century layers, rings, crosses, and fragments of Latin inscriptions. In some cases, these were found in pagan graves, suggesting either cultural overlap or spoils taken from Christian households. Oral traditions may also have preserved Christian ideas, though filtered through changing lenses. Some folk stories contain traces of gospel parables, twisted, perhaps, but recognizable. These echoes suggest that Christianity never entirely disappeared. It simply went underground. In isolated villas, perhaps a widow kept her late husband's psalter, reading it by firelight. A child, raised on both Saxon sagas and Latin prayers, might whisper the Lord's Prayer before sleep, half remembered, half imagined. In this way, Christianity became less of an organized religion and more of a quiet persistence. The Irish mission and the monastic revival. Meanwhile, across the sea, something extraordinary was happening in Ireland. Unlike Britain, Ireland had never been part of the Roman Empire. It had its own tribal structures, its own deities, and its own laws. But in the 5th century, missionaries, most famously St. Patrick, introduced Christianity. Unlike the top-down model of Rome, Irish Christianity was decentralized, monastic, and remarkably adaptive. By the 6th century, Irish monastic schools were flourishing. Centers like Clonmacnoise and Bangor produced scribes, scholars, and missionaries. Their illuminated manuscripts, written in vibrant inks on calfskin, preserved not only scripture but classical learning. And they looked eastward to Britain. Monks like Columbus set sail to spread the faith to the Picts and Scots. Others followed, establishing outposts along the western coast of Britain. In these Irish and British monasteries, Christianity was not just preserved, it was rekindled. It learned to survive without cities, without armies, without emperors. It learned to take root in the soil. A new kind of church. This emerging Christianity, shaped by hardship, took on a character of endurance. It was marked by humility, solitude, and resilience. Unlike the earlier Roman version, tied to status and civic life, this was a Christianity of mud and thatch. It focused on manual labor, farming, weaving, copying texts. Silence, hours spent in contemplation or in scriptoria. Community, tight-knit groups where every member worked and prayed. Wandering, Missionaries traveled light, sleeping under the stars, speaking the local tongues. These were the roots that would eventually flower in the great missions of the 7th century. But at this stage, the church was still quiet, still recovering, waiting for the tide to turn. Throughout the 6th century, the Saxon kingdom strengthened. Pagan kings ruled from wooden halls. Poets sang of Woden and Thunder. Battles raged across the landscape. Christianity was not welcome in these courts. And yet behind the lines, in quiet valleys and wind-lashed islands, the church waited. In Iona, in Bardsey, in the western hills of Wales and the crags of Cumbria, monks tended sheep and copied scriptures. They trained young men not only in faith, but in patience. They believed that the tide would turn, that the Saxon world so brutal, so proud might someday open its ears to a new message. The question was, who would carry that message into the heart of the pagan kingdoms, and would they survive long enough to see it flourish? By the late 6th century, Christianity in Britain was no longer an imperial religion, but a scattered memory alive in the West, extinguished in the East, and flickering faintly in between. The old Roman towns were now skeletal reminders of a lost world. Broken arches, weed-choked forums, and overgrown graves stood as silent testimony to a past where Latin prayers once rose with the smoke of incense. And yet the faith had not vanished. It had merely gone quiet, withdrawn into corners of the island, waiting for the conditions to change. It had shed its Roman grandeur and learned to live with fewer comforts, fewer allies, fewer voices. But even in silence, faith can plan its return. Rebuilding the pathways, survival in the West. In the Celtic West Wales, Cornwall, Cumbria, and beyond, Christianity endured not through might, but through tradition. Monasteries and hermitages, often no more than a few huts and a chapel, served as centers of learning and devotion. These places became sanctuaries for ancient texts. Latin survived here, sometimes barely. Psalters were copied in cramped scriptoria, sometimes on reused parchment. Monks committed entire gospels to memory in case their manuscripts decayed or were destroyed. Oral tradition, always vital in Celtic cultures, played an increasing role in preserving theology. These were not seminaries or universities. They were places of discipline, isolation, and immense purpose. The Christian West of Britain became a forge for character, forming the missionaries who would soon bring the faith back to the Anglo-Saxons. But before that, the seeds of change had to be sown in the East. The Saxon view of the Christian past. For the pagan Anglo-Saxon kings and nobles, the Roman past was a curiosity. They built their halls near the ruins of Roman villas, occasionally reusing the stones. They marveled at the old roads, which still connected their regions more efficiently than any new path. But they did not understand the Christian inscriptions or the architectural designs of basilicas. Roman Christianity, if remembered at all, was seen as part of a fallen world, perhaps imbued with magic or power, but not wisdom. Yet the Saxons were not entirely cut off from outside influence. Through trade with Gaul and intermarriage with Frankish elites, news filtered in. One important development would change the course of Britain's religious history. A Christian woman would marry a pagan king. Her presence would shift the balance. Ethelbert and Bertha, a royal turning point. Around the year 580, a Frankish princess named Bertha, a Christian, was married to King Ethelbert of Kent, a powerful Saxon ruler. She came with her own Bishop Leodhard and was allowed to maintain her Christian practices. Ethelbert, though still pagan, permitted a church to be restored in Canterbury for her worship. This was the first official toleration of Christianity by an Anglo-Saxon king, and it was a quiet but critical moment. It's unlikely that Ethelbert was deeply moved by Bertha's piety at first. His interest was probably political. An alliance with the Franks brought trade, prestige, and potential military support. But even as a gesture of diplomacy, the allowance of Christian practice opened the gates for more substantial change. Soon Rome would take notice. Gregory the Great's curiosity. Far away, in the heart of the former empire, Pope Gregory I, later called Gregory the Great, had heard of the Anglo-Saxons. The story goes that he saw some fair-haired boys in a Roman slave market and asked where they were from. On being told they were Angles, he remarked, "Not Angles, but angels if they were only Christian." Whether true or embellished, this moment planted a seed in Gregory's mind. He decided to send missionaries to the Anglo-Saxon lands. The church in Britain, what little remained, needed revival, and the pagan East required evangelization. He chose a monk named Augustine to lead this mission. Augustine, reluctant at first, would eventually become one of the most significant figures in English Christian history. The arrival of the mission. In 597, Augustine and a group of about 40 monks landed in Kent. They were not warriors, and they didn't come with wealth. They came with books, relics, and a message. They were welcomed cautiously by Ethelbert, who agreed to hear their teachings. Remarkably, within a year, Ethelbert was baptized. His conversion gave Augustine the political cover to begin spreading the faith. He was granted the old Roman Church at Canterbury and began establishing an ecclesiastical base. But this new mission did not connect immediately with the older, Celtic Christian traditions of the West. The Roman and Celtic churches were estranged culturally, theologically, and geographically. They celebrated Easter on different dates. Their liturgies differed. Their views on ecclesiastical hierarchy clashed. Augustine attempted to unify them but met resistance. For the time being, the two branches would operate in parallel, both Christian, yet separate. The legacy of the Roman seeds. As Augustine's mission took hold, it might seem that the early Christian presence in Roman Britain had been eclipsed. The church he built was more directly connected to Rome than to the fatting Celtic churches or the lost bishops of the 4th century. And yet the Roman seeds mattered. Without them, there would have been no memory of Christianity to draw on, no lingering symbols, no place names like Eccles, from the Latin ecclesia, meaning church, no half-remembered customs or faint remnants of Latin prayers. The memory of earlier Christians, those who whispered the gospel during persecutions, who gathered in villas, who built modest churches, allowed Augustine's mission to resonate in places where the soil had once been tilled. Even though the original churches had crumbled, the idea of Christianity had left impressions too deep to be erased entirely. An island between ages. By the year 600, Britain stood between two worlds. To the west, the Celtic Christian world endured, vibrant and isolated, monastic and rugged. To the east, a newly Roman-aligned church was beginning to form, structured and diplomatic, connected to the broader Latin Christian world. Between them lay tension but also promise. This meeting of traditions would lead to future councils, like the Synod of Whitby, where the two paths would seek unity. But for now, both branches moved cautiously forward. Christianity in Britain was no longer a whispered faith. It was emerging, again, from the shadows. But it had changed. It had been broken, rebuilt, and reshaped. It had passed through fire of persecution, abandonment, and cultural eclipse, and emerged not stronger but wiser. This first story of Christian Britain closes not with triumph, but with endurance. The question that remains is not whether Christianity would survive. It clearly had. What kind of Christianity would define the Anglo-Saxon world? Would it be Roman or Celtic, imperial or local, unified or diverse? And what would be lost in the effort to answer that question? Story 2, Augustine's mission, a stranger from Rome. You are in Rome. The year is 595. The city, once the mighty center of an empire, now hums quietly beneath the weight of memory. Ruins coexist with churches. The Senate is long gone. In its place, a new kind of power rises, papal, ecclesiastical, rooted in theology instead of conquest. And seated at the head of this new spiritual order is Pope Gregory I, later known as Gregory the Great. It is under his steady, contemplative gaze that a plan is forming, a mission to bring Christianity back to Britain. And the man chosen to lead it is not a warrior, not a bishop, and certainly not eager. His name is Augustine, a monk of the Benedictine monastery of St. Andrew in Rome. Obedient, pious, and cautious, he will become one of the most important figures in English religious history, not by desire, but by duty. This is the story of his journey. The spark of curiosity. Gregory had long held a fascination with Britain. His interest may have been theological or symbolic, but it was also strategic. The island, once touched by Roman Christianity, had fallen into pagan hands. The Saxons now ruled its eastern kingdoms, and although isolated Christian communities survived in the west, the island no longer sat within the cohesive Christian world. Gregory believed this could change, but he did not wish to send just anyone. The man chosen must be humble yet firm, doctrinally sound, and willing to face unimaginable uncertainty. Augustine met those qualifications. But Augustine was no adventurer. He was a monastic prior, used to the rhythms of liturgy, study, and silence. He had never crossed the Alps. The idea of sailing to a distant land full of pagan warlords must have been terrifying. Still, he obeyed. The journey begins. In 596, Augustine set out with a group of roughly 40 monks. They traveled north through Italy, following the old Roman roads decaying but still walkable across the Alps and into Gaul. Their destination was Kent, a southeastern Saxon kingdom ruled by King Ethelbert. The choice of Kent was not accidental. Ethelbert had married Bertha, a Christian Frankish princess who had brought her chaplain and her faith with her. Though Ethelbert remained pagan, he tolerated Bertha's religion and even allowed her to worship in a small, restored church in Canterbury, believed to be the ancient Roman Durovernum Cantiacorum. This, Gregory reasoned, provided a foothold. And yet, somewhere along the way, perhaps in southern Gaul, Augustine faltered. The stories say that he and his companions were so alarmed by tales of barbarism, danger, and linguistic challenges that they considered turning back. Augustine wrote to Pope Gregory asking permission to abandon the mission. Gregory's reply was resolute: continue. He even sent letters of support to the Frankish rulers to ease Augustine's passage. Encouraged, or at least compelled, the monks resumed their journey. Arrival in Kent. In the spring of 597, Augustine and his party finally landed on the Isle of Thanet, a coastal outpost at the eastern tip of Kent. They were greeted with curiosity, not violence. Ethelbert, cautious but diplomatic, agreed to meet them in the open air, a telling detail. According to Bede, the king feared the monks might cast spells indoors. Superstition still ruled the imagination. There, on the grass with the sea wind at their backs, Augustine spoke through interpreters, perhaps in broken Frankish or Latin. He explained that he came not as a conqueror, but as a messenger of a different kind of king. What followed next was, by the standards of missionary work, astonishing. Ethelbert gave them permission to preach. He offered them a place to live in Canterbury and the freedom to convert his people, though he himself did not immediately convert. This calm exchange between a Roman monk and a Saxon king, was the foundation of a future English church. Establishing the mission. In Canterbury, Augustine and his monks settled into a rhythm of prayer, teaching, and service. They likely began by restoring Roman ruins for use as worship spaces. The old church of St. Martin, where Bertha prayed, became their base. They celebrated Mass. They baptized converts. They spoke gently, lived simply, and waited. Word spread. The Saxons, steeped in warrior culture and wary of magic, saw in the monks something different. They dressed oddly. They didn't carry weapons. They healed the sick. They invoked a God who claimed to rule not through swords but through love. Perhaps most importantly, They came with the approval of both the king's queen and a powerful figure in Rome. This gave them credibility. It also made conversion less risky. No one wished to offend the king. Within months, Ethelbert himself was baptized. Symbolism of the king's conversion. Ethelbert's baptism was symbolic on many levels. As king, he stood as the head of his people's law and customs. For him to convert meant, in essence, a new kind of law was being accepted, one shaped not by tribal vengeance but by mercy and grace. But Ethelbert was also careful. He did not force conversion on his people. In this way, his reign marked a transition from imposed religion to chosen faith. This slow, consent-based conversion would shape the development of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England for decades to come. Still, Augustine was cautious. He sought structure. With Gregory's permission, he was consecrated bishop and established Canterbury as his seat. A church was founded, then a monastery. The faith was no longer just a foreign curiosity, it was building roots. Letters from Gregory. Throughout this period, Augustine remained in close correspondence with Pope Gregory. These letters, some of which survive, reveal the practical challenges Augustine faced. He asked how to deal with local pagan temples. Gregory's answer: do not destroy them, clean them, reuse them. Let the people keep their festivals but redirect their meaning. This was an act of genius or pragmatism. Gregory understood that wiping away tradition entirely would only provoke resistance. Instead, Christianize it. This approach shaped English Christianity deeply. Pagan customs were absorbed rather than crushed. Sacred springs became holy wells. Festivals like Easter morphed into Easter. Christianity in Britain became a syncretic faith, not diluted, but textured. Resistance and cultural tensions. Not everything went smoothly. While the Kentish mission was gaining ground, Augustine made efforts to reach out to the British bishops, those Christian leaders still active in the West, especially in Wales. He invited them to a meeting, hoping to unite the churches of Britain under Roman practices. But the British bishops were unimpressed. They viewed Augustine not as a savior, but as a foreigner, a Roman emissary who had ignored their survival through the darkest times. They bristled at his authority and refused to submit. For now, the churches remained divided: Roman in the east, Celtic in the west. The groundwork had been laid, but the path to unity was long. A new beginning. By the end of his life, Augustine had established more than a mission. He had reconnected England to the broader Christian world. He had ordained clergy, founded schools, and baptized thousands. And yet he died with much still unfinished. He had not united the churches. He had not reached the northern kingdoms. He had not seen the full fruits of his labor. But he had changed the course of English history. From a reluctant monk to the first Archbishop of Canterbury, Augustine's quiet endurance created the foundation for centuries of religious life in England. And as the bells rang over Canterbury's rooftops for the first time in centuries, a new question echoed across the Saxon world. Would this fragile new church survive the turbulence of kings, conflict, and time, or would it, like the Roman ruins, be buried once more? By the time Augustine's new Christian mission had taken root in Canterbury, the landscape around him was both promising and precarious. The Anglo-Saxon world was still largely pagan. The few Christians in Britain were culturally and ecclesiastically different from the Roman model Augustine knew. And while King Ethelbert's conversion opened many doors, it did not guarantee long-term success. To build something that would last, Augustine needed more than permission. He needed structure, diplomacy, and a deep understanding of the world he had entered. This section explores how Augustine slowly wove the Roman Church into the daily life of Anglo-Saxon England, not through force, but through methodical adaptation, negotiation, and vision. Life in early Canterbury. Canterbury in 597 was no longer the Roman Durovernum, but it retained some of its ancient layout. Ruined villas, broken walls, and weathered Roman roads provided the skeletal remains of imperial order. Augustine and his monks began the laborious task of reusing these foundations physically and spiritually. They restored St. Martin's Church, originally from Roman times and used by Queen Bertha. It became their spiritual base, while the surrounding area slowly developed into a monastic complex. There was no sudden transformation. The monks lived simply praying, teaching, helping the poor. They likely dressed in rough woolen habits and observed a Benedictine-style daily routine, ora et labora, pray and work. To the Saxons, this kind of life was unusual, even unsettling. These men did not fight, farm, or boast of heroic deeds. They chanted strange songs, wrote on animal skin, and washed the feet of strangers. Over time, their gentleness became more persuasive than any sermon. The slow conversion of the people. King Ethelbert's conversion had symbolic importance, but the people of Kent did not immediately follow their king into baptism. In Saxon culture, loyalty to one's chief was vital, but religion was deeply personal and tied to nature, ancestry, and clan rituals. Augustine understood this. Following Pope Gregory's guidance, he practiced gradualism. He avoided attacking local traditions outright. He allowed festivals to continue. He and his monks explained Christian concepts using analogies from the Saxon worldview. Where the Saxons honored the changing of seasons, Augustine emphasized the Christian calendar. Easter became a symbol of renewal. Saints' feast days were layered over older pagan festivals. Sacred springs, once linked to local spirits, were rededicated to saints. Rather than erase the past, Augustine worked with it. This approach gave the people time to adjust. They were not abandoning their culture, they were enriching it with new meaning. Institutional structure begins. One of Augustine's first goals was to formalize the church in Kent. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for English ecclesiastical structure that would endure for centuries. He established the Cathedral of Christ Church in Canterbury. It was modest at first, likely built on the ruins of an earlier Roman structure, but it became the spiritual center of his mission. Next, he built a monastery just outside the city walls, later known as St. Augustine's Abbey. It was here that monks lived, studied, and eventually were buried. Augustine himself would be laid to rest here. But more than buildings, Augustine wanted a functioning bishopric. He began ordaining clergy, training Saxon converts, and writing letters back to Rome asking for guidance on how to organize this fledgling church. He requested, for instance, that bishops be placed in London and York, echoing Roman administrative divisions. While those specific goals took decades to realize, the idea of a network of sees took hold. In time, the English church would become one of the most organized in Europe. The conflict with the Celtic Church. While Augustine's mission in Kent was progressing, he faced a more complicated task in his dealings with the Celtic Christian churches of Western Britain. These communities had survived the fall of Roman Britain but had developed independently. Their monasteries dotted the hills of Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria. They followed different customs, calculating Easter using a distinct method, shaving their monks, tonsures differently, and resisting Roman authority. Augustine hoped to unify them under Roman practice. He believed the church in Britain could not thrive divided. He called for a meeting with British bishops, likely somewhere near the border of Saxon and British territory. Bede later recounts that the bishops came, accompanied by monks, but left unimpressed. They felt Augustine lacked humility. They did not recognize his authority. They viewed Rome as distant and irrelevant to their insular traditions. Augustine, for his part, may have misunderstood how much pride and resilience these churches had after surviving isolation and conflict. The meeting ended with no unity. The Roman and Celtic branches of British Christianity remained separate two traditions walking parallel paths. Miracles and memory. As Augustine's influence grew, stories of miracles began to circulate. One tale tells of a blind Saxon regaining his sight after baptism. Another claims that a deadly plague in Kent spared those baptized into the faith. Such stories, whether embellished, symbolic, or believed as literal truth, played a vital role in conversion. For a people steeped in the supernatural, the idea that the Christian God could heal, protect, or punish was persuasive. But miracles also served another purpose: memory. In a largely illiterate culture, stories were the foundation of belief. These accounts would be told again and again in mead halls, at village gatherings, and during church services. Augustine became not just a foreign monk, but a figure woven into oral history. Letters from a distant pope. Throughout this time, Augustine kept in touch with Pope Gregory, who remained deeply interested in the mission's progress. The Pope's letters were practical, pastoral, and political. He gave advice on marriage laws, liturgical practices, and clerical conduct. He stressed the importance of adapting to local customs where possible, showing mercy rather than severity, and avoiding the arrogance of foreign superiority. One striking instruction was Gregory's emphasis that the Anglo-Saxons were not to be treated as barbarians, but as future Christians worthy of respect, patience, and education. This attitude shaped Augustine's leadership. While firm in doctrine, he remained careful not to provoke cultural hostility. Augustine's final years. By the early 600s, Augustine had done what few expected. He had established Christianity among a pagan people without war, without conquest, and without Roman political backing. His final years were spent consolidating gains, training clergy, and preparing the next generation of missionaries. He likely dealt with internal disagreements, cultural misunderstandings, and the creeping challenges of maintaining momentum. In 604, Augustine died. He was buried in the abbey he founded outside Canterbury's city walls. In life, he had been hesitant, overwhelmed at times, even reluctant. In death, he became the first Archbishop of Canterbury and a symbol of Christian endurance in a new land. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage. His legacy lived on in the very stones of the church he helped shape. But the church he left behind still faced uncertainty. There were rival pagan kings in other kingdoms. The Celtic Church remained separate, and missionary work in the north had barely begun. The seeds were planted, but the question remained: would the church survive beyond Augustine? Would it grow into something truly English, or remain a Roman transplant waiting to be tested by time? When Augustine died in the year 604, he left behind more than buildings, more than bishops. He left behind a fragile, quietly transforming landscape, a cultural, political, and spiritual shift that had just begun. His mission, while modest in scale and largely confined to the Kingdom of Kent, would ripple outward across the tapestry of Anglo-Saxon England. But the road ahead was not guaranteed. The early Christian church in England faced threats not only from remaining pagan kingdoms, but from within: linguistic divides, rival Christian traditions, political instability, and the ever-present risk of collapse. And yet, what began with a reluctant monk's journey from Rome laid the foundation for an enduring institution that would shape the identity of a people. This final section explores what happened after Augustine, how his work continued or nearly unraveled, and how his mission shaped the idea of a Christian England. A church without its founder. Augustine's death left a leadership gap. His successor, Lawrence, was a monk from the original Roman mission. Lawrence had learned under Augustine and had helped build the structures of the new church. Yet without Augustine's diplomatic skill and visionary grounding, his leadership would soon be tested. Not long after Augustine's death, King Ethelbert, the first Christian king of Kent, also died. His son, Eadbald, reverted to paganism. Suddenly, the church found itself in danger of being unraveled from the top down. Baptism slowed. Christian influence in court waned. Lawrence and the other Roman missionaries considered fleeing back to Gaul. According to Bede's account, it was a vision of St. Peter, scourging Lawrence in a dream for his cowardice, that changed his mind. Lawrence stayed, confronted Eadbald, and whether by persuasion or divine coincidence, the king reconverted. The crisis passed, but barely. This moment revealed how fragile Augustine's legacy was. It depended on both royal favor and deep-rooted conversion, neither of which were guaranteed. Expanding beyond Kent. Despite these early setbacks, the church did not stall. Over the following decades, Augustine's successors continued to send missionaries to other kingdoms. In 604, shortly before his death, Augustine had consecrated 2 new bishops. Mellitus, sent to London, the heart of the East Saxons. Justus, sent to Rochester, establishing a second bishopric in Kent. Mellitus' mission in London was initially promising. King Siebert converted and allowed the establishment of a Christian presence. But upon Siebert's death, his sons expelled Mellitus, rejecting the new faith. Once again, Christianity retreated when royal support vanished. This pattern repeated across England. In regions where kings converted, missions flourished. When those kings died or were overthrown, churches were burned, monks fled, and baptisms were forgotten. Christianity's expansion was fragile, deeply tied to politics rather than grassroots belief. And yet, the missionaries did not give up. Augustine's architectural legacy. While the faith wavered from court to court, the physical structures Augustine left behind endured and grew. In Canterbury, the Cathedral of Christ Church and St. Augustine's Abbey became enduring centers of religious life, learning, and record-keeping. These buildings were more than places of worship. They were anchors of Romanita's reminders of the broader Christian world that extended beyond the island's borders. Monks at Canterbury copied texts, educated converts, and trained future bishops. They preserved not only theology but administrative skill, legal customs, Latin literacy, and monastic discipline. In this way, Augustine's impact reached beyond religion. His mission quietly began the re-Romanization of England, not in political terms but in cultural memory. Relationship with the papacy. Augustine had been appointed by Pope Gregory I, and throughout his mission, he kept a steady line of communication with Rome. After Augustine's death, his successors maintained this connection, but with increasing independence. Rome was still respected as the heart of Christendom, but the English Church gradually began to adapt its own customs. By the mid-7th century, it had developed a uniquely Anglo-Roman character rooted in papal authority but shaped by local kings, geography, and evolving cultural practices. This growing autonomy would eventually lead to disagreements between Roman missionaries and the Celtic Church, particularly around practices like the calculation of Easter, tonsure styles, and ecclesiastical hierarchy. Augustine had tried to bridge the gap, but he had failed. That bridge would be rebuilt, painfully and gradually, by future church leaders. Augustine and the Celtic divide. Augustine's attempt to unify the Roman and Celtic churches is one of the more overlooked yet important failures of his mission. In his meeting with British bishops and Celtic monks, likely in the early 600s, Augustine requested that they adopt Roman customs and accept his authority as archbishop. But the British Christians, isolated in Wales and the Northwest, who had kept the faith alive through the darkest centuries, saw no reason to submit to a Roman stranger. They had survived without Rome, and they had no interest in being told what to do by men who had only just arrived. This impasse would define English Christianity for decades. The Celtic and Roman branches would remain separate until the pivotal Synod of Whitby in 664, more than 60 years after Augustine's death. Thus, one of the key legacies of Augustine's mission was not just what he achieved, but what he left unresolved: memory and sanctification. Over time, Augustine's memory was sanctified. Stories of his miracles multiplied. Pilgrims visited his tomb. The abbey that bore his name became a place of religious significance. He was referred to as Augustine of the English, to distinguish him from the earlier Saint Augustine of Hippo. He became a symbol of missionary courage and Christian perseverance in a foreign land. But curiously, his legend remained quiet. Unlike the warrior saints or martyr bishops, Augustine's memory was calm, administrative, even bureaucratic. He had not died a martyr's death. He had not confronted kings with fiery prophecy. He had organized, written letters, taught doctrine, and persuaded carefully. In this way, he represented a different kind of hero, the institutional founder, the patient sower. And that, perhaps, is why his legacy lasted. Lessons in fragility. Looking back, Augustine's mission offers an unusual lesson in the fragility of faith. It did not take hold by force. It did not conquer through spectacle. It advanced in fits and starts rising with one king, retreating under another. It depended on roads half broken, languages half shared, and symbols half remembered. It required constant repair. And yet those repairs were made by successors like Lawrence, Mellitus, Justus, and Honorius, by queens like Bertha, and later Christian women who influenced their husbands and sons, by anonymous monks who carried books across muddy paths to teach children how to pray in Latin. Augustine did not live to see the full harvest of his planting, but in the centuries that followed, his mission would bear fruit in cathedrals, monasteries, illuminated manuscripts, and the spiritual transformation of a kingdom. A final reflection. When Augustine first landed on the shores of Kent, he could not have imagined the centuries of history that would follow from his simple mission. He came as a foreign monk to a pagan land. He died an archbishop in a budding Christian nation. He did not unite the churches. He did not convert all the kings. He did not build a perfect church. But he began, and from his beginning, 1,000 others would follow. In the end, Augustine's mission reminds us that history does not always turn on grand events or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it turns on a quiet man, walking patiently on ancient roads, speaking Latin to strangers, carrying scrolls in a satchel, and planting ideas in foreign soil, not knowing whether they would grow, but planting them anyway. Story 3. King Ethelbert and the Christian Queen. You are standing on the southeastern coast of Britain in the late 6th century, sometime before the arrival of Augustine's mission. The land is divided, its kingdoms ruled by men who measure their power by the sword and the loyalty of their thanes. In Kent, the dominant kingdom in southern England, King Ethelbert reigns from his hall at Canterbury, a city with Roman bones and Saxon breath. He is a king of the old gods, or so his people believe. They offer to Woden, Thunor, and the spirits of the forests. Rites are held under sacred trees. Offerings are made at springs and rivers. The world of Ethelbert is a world of cycles, warbends, and ancestral honor. And then from across the channel, a queen arrives. A woman unlike any seen in his court, draped not only in royal garments, but in a faith from a foreign empire, a religion with one God, one book, and one bishop. Her name is Bertha. She is a Christian, and she has brought with her the quiet beginnings of a revolution that no sword could spark. A marriage of politics and faith. Bertha was a Frankish princess, daughter of Charibert I, king of Paris, and part of the mighty Merovingian dynasty. She had grown up in a world where Christianity was no longer persecuted, it was dominant. Her ancestors had converted generations earlier, and the church now walked hand in hand with Frankish kings. Her education was likely infused with Latin scripture, Christian liturgy, and a sense of sacred royalty. She may have visited churches dedicated to Saint Martin, the soldier saint so beloved in Gaul. She may have spoken with bishops, worn crosses, and learned the Psalms by heart. When Ethelbert asked for her hand in marriage, it was a diplomatic masterstroke. An alliance with the Franks meant trade, influence, and perhaps protection from rivals. But there was a condition. Bertha would only come to Kent if she could practice her religion freely. Ethelbert agreed. Perhaps he was indifferent to her God. Perhaps he simply wanted the alliance. But in that agreement, a small clause in a royal negotiation, the door was opened for Christianity to quietly re-enter England. Bertha's arrival in Kent. Bertha arrived with her chaplain, a bishop named Leodhard. He was not a missionary in the traditional sense. He did not preach to the Saxons. His role was to provide religious guidance to the queen, to celebrate Mass, and to maintain her Christian identity in a pagan land. Still, his presence mattered. He was a bishop of Rome, a symbol of a wider world that Kent barely knew. Bertha and Leodhard began to restore a small Roman-era church just outside Canterbury's city walls. This church, dedicated to Saint Martin, became a sanctuary, a place where Latin was sung again. Prayers were offered to the Christian God, and a spark was quietly kindled. To the people of Kent, this must have seemed peculiar. A church was not a hall, it was not a grove. It was enclosed, solemn, unfamiliar. The sounds, the rituals, the symbols, everything foreign. And yet it stood. The quiet influence of a queen. Bertha's role in the Christianization of Kent is easily overlooked, but no less crucial than that of Augustine himself. For years before the Roman mission, she embodied Christianity in a Saxon court. She bore herself with dignity, maintained her rights, and did not waver. We do not know her words. The chronicles do not record speeches or letters, but her presence was a kind of diplomacy, soft power, long before the term existed. Every time she processed to St. Martin's for worship, every time she declined to eat during a fast, every time she prayed, she was showing an alternative way of being royal, a queen in service not to the old gods, but to Christ. Her servants, her ladies-in-waiting, her stewards, some of them must have converted quietly and slowly. A whisper here, a cross there, small ripples that spread through the court like perfume. And Ethelbert watched. Ethelbert's tolerance. It is remarkable that Ethelbert allowed all this. In a culture where kings were often divine in their own right, and where gods were tied to military success, allowing a foreign god into his household was no small risk. Yet he did. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps it was pragmatism. Perhaps Bertha was persuasive in ways the record doesn't reveal. But Ethelbert not only tolerated Christianity, he respected it enough to give it space. This was the soil into which Augustine would later plant his mission. Without Bertha, without her years of quiet endurance, Augustine's arrival in 597 might have ended with rejection or worse. A woman between worlds. Bertha stood between two worlds, the fatting memory of Rome and the raw energy of Saxon Britain. She understood Latin and courtly etiquette. She also understood the rough language and customs of her husband's people. She moved between them with grace. In many ways, she symbolized the transition England itself would undergo. From pagan to Christian, from warrior cults to church councils, from oral myth to written gospel. And yet her story remains fragmentary. We know little of her thoughts. We have no writings, no recorded conversations. Her influence was structural, not performative. She did not preach. She did not build monasteries, but she prepared the ground. An unseen hand in conversion. When Augustine arrived in 597, he was welcomed not just by the king, but by a court already familiar with Christian practice. Bertha likely introduced Augustine to Ethelbert. She may have spoken in his favor, reassured her husband, explained the rituals. After Ethelbert's baptism, an event that changed English history, Augustine stayed, established churches, and began converting the people. But it was Bertha who had kept the faith alive like an ember in a hearth during the long years before any missionary set foot on Kentish soil. Without her, Augustine may have found a harder land, a colder court, a king less willing to listen. A queen remembered. Later generations would honor Bertha. The Church of St. Martin still stands today, the oldest church in continuous use in the English-speaking world. She is remembered in Kent as a foundress, a bridge between cultures. But she is not canonized. There are no miracles attributed to her. Her life was ordinary in its details, quiet, devout, enduring. And that, perhaps, is what makes her so important. She represents the boring miracle of cultural transformation, the slow, human process by which empires fade. New ideas take root, and change is born not in fire or blood, but in persistence and faith. As she prayed in a stone church outside the walls of Canterbury, one must wonder, did she know that her quiet choices would shape the religion of a kingdom? Or did she, like so many others, simply do what she believed was right without any idea that the world would turn on it? The year is 597. In the city of Canterbury, Roman ruins linger under moss and ivy. The Saxons rule here now, but the bones of a lost empire are still visible in the stones and layout. Amid this, the winds carry something new. Foreign monks in dark robes walk the streets. Their language is strange, their manners stranger. They do not carry swords. They do not demand tribute. They come with books and crosses, speaking softly of a man who died and rose again. And at the heart of it all is King Ethelbert of Kent, ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in southern England. He watches, he listens, and soon he makes a decision that would ripple through centuries. He accepts baptism into the Christian faith. But this was not a sudden conversion. It was the result of years of subtle influence, diplomatic foresight, and a mind carefully weighing past, present, and future. The shape of power in Ethelbert's Kent. Ethelbert was not just a local king. He held the title of Bretwalda Overlord of multiple Saxon kingdoms. His influence extended beyond Kent into surrounding territories like Essex and East Anglia. He was a lawgiver, a war leader, and a ruler whose authority rested on deep cultural expectations. In the pagan world, a king's legitimacy was tied to the gods. Divine favor meant victory in war, bountiful harvests, and the loyalty of men. To abandon the gods Woden, Thunor, and the ancestral spirits was to risk not only personal disgrace but political disaster. For Ethelbert, the decision to convert could not be made lightly. The role of Bertha and the Roman mission. For years, Bertha had been practicing Christianity within the royal court. With her came her Frankish culture, her chaplain Leodhard, and a small Christian retinue. Though she did not attempt to convert her husband directly, her consistency and patience laid a foundation of trust. When Augustine and his monks arrived in 597, they were not the first Christians Ethelbert had seen, but they were the first to come with a mission: to convert the kingdom, not just dwell in it. The fact that Ethelbert agreed to meet them outside, in the open, where no magic could harm him, suggests that he was at once cautious and curious. Bede records that Ethelbert listened carefully to Augustine's preaching. He did not immediately convert. Instead, he offered them protection and the freedom to preach. It was a calculated gesture. He gave them space, but not yet his allegiance. Over time, that changed. Why Ethelbert converted? The motives behind Ethelbert's baptism have been debated for centuries. The truth likely includes multiple layers. 1. Political advantage. Christianity was the dominant religion of Frankish Gaul and growing steadily across Europe. By aligning himself with Rome and the Frankish Church, Ethelbert gained international legitimacy and diplomatic weight. 2. Domestic harmony. Bertha's continued worship might have made conversion a more domestic decision than a political one. By adopting her faith, Ethelbert could unify the royal household under a single spiritual banner. 3. Curiosity and conviction. Bede suggests that Ethelbert was genuinely moved by Augustine's teaching. Perhaps the idea of a God who valued humility, peace, and eternal life appealed to a king weary of blood and uncertainty. 4. Control of chain. By converting voluntarily, Ethelbert positioned himself as the arbiter of religious change in his kingdom. He could guide it, manage it, and prevent chaos. The baptism ceremony. We do not know the exact details of Ethelbert's baptism, but we can imagine it based on known rites of the time. It likely took place in Canterbury, perhaps in or near St. Martin's Church. Bertha may have stood nearby. The ceremony would have included the renunciation of Satan, an anointing with oil, and a triple immersion or pouring with water. Latin prayers would have echoed off stone walls. A simple but profound transformation took place. A pagan king became a Christian monarch. And with that act, Kent became the first officially Christian Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Public reaction. Ethelbert did not force his subjects to convert. This is significant. In a world where royal decree often meant life or death, his restraint marked a new kind of leadership. His decision set a tone of tolerance that helped Christianity spread without resistance. Gradually, thanes, warriors, and families began to accept baptism, not all at once, not everywhere, but the tide had turned. The king's conversion gave legitimacy to Augustine's mission and attracted further support from Rome and the Frankish Church. Baptism became associated with loyalty to the crown, access to literacy, and a connection to the wider Christian world. Ethelbert as lawgiver. Around this time, Ethelbert also produced the first written law code in any Germanic language, a remarkable document, preserved in Old English. His laws are not explicitly Christian, but their tone suggests a concern for justice, restraint, and social order. The church was protected by law. Compensation for harming a clergyman was set high. Marriage laws reflected Christian influence. These were small steps, but they signaled a king who saw religion and governance as intertwined. Aftermath and legacy. Ethelbert ruled for nearly 20 more years after his baptism. He continued to support the church, granted land for monasteries, and helped Augustine establish the Archbishopric of Canterbury. He became, in effect, the patron of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England. But his conversion also had ripple effects. The Kingdom of Essex, under his influence, allowed missionaries like Mellitus to preach in London. The groundwork was laid for future missions to Northumbria and East Anglia. The Celtic Church took notice, even if it remained wary of Roman alignment. Upon his death in 616, Ethelbert was buried according to Christian tradition at the newly built abbey of Saints Peter and Paul, later St. Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury. He would be remembered not as a martyr, but as a model Christian king. The shadow of his son. Not all went smoothly after Ethelbert's death. His son, Eadbald, reverted to paganism briefly, undoing years of progress. The church was tested. Missionaries were expelled from Essex. Lawrence, Augustine's successor, considered fleeing. But the legacy of Ethelbert was stronger than one generation. Eadbald eventually reconverted. The church endured. And the example of a king who had adopted Christianity without force, without war, and with thoughtfulness remained. A monarch's quiet strength. In the grand sweep of history, Ethelbert might seem unremarkable. He did not wage great wars. He did not write epics. He did not die for his faith. And yet he made a choice, a quiet, strategic, and deeply personal choice that changed the direction of a kingdom. He did not rage against the dying of the old gods. He simply opened the door to something new, slowly, respectfully, permanently. And so we are left with this question. Was Ethelbert's greatest strength not in conquest, but in restraint, the wisdom to embrace change not with violence, but with vision? When King Ethelbert died around the year 616, he left behind a kingdom changed not by conquest or collapse, but by quiet transformation. The arrival of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England is often credited to Augustine, the Roman missionary. But the endurance and stability of that transformation owed as much perhaps more to Ethelbert and Bertha, whose partnership set the tone for a new kind of kingship. In this final section of their story, we examine how Ethelbert's reign laid the institutional, cultural, and legal foundations of Christian kingship in England subtle, powerful, and enduring. The building of sacred space. One of Ethelbert's most significant legacies was his support for the physical establishment of the church in Kent. Christianity, after all, is not only a set of beliefs, it is a religion of buildings, altars, reliquaries, and sacred geography. Under his reign, St. Martin's Church continued to serve as the Queen's Chapel and the earliest base for Christian worship. The old Roman city of Canterbury was reimagined not as a pagan or civic center, but as an episcopal city. Ethelbert granted land for the construction of the monastery of Saints Peter and Paul, later known as St. Augustine's Abbey, where monks could live, pray, and be buried. These acts of royal patronage had political weight. They declared that the new religion was not a fringe belief, it was sponsored by the king himself. In a culture where land was power, giving land to the church elevated it to the level of warrior nobles. Monks became part of the kingdom's elite, quiet, literate, celibate elite, but elite nonetheless. Law and the Christian ethos. Around the same time as his conversion, Ethelbert produced the first known written law code in any Germanic language. Written in Old English rather than Latin, this code marks the intersection of Christian ethics with Anglo-Saxon customary law. The laws, numbered and straightforward, covered fines and compensations for injuries, thefts, and social offenses. At first glance, they seem more tribal than theological. If someone kills a man, let him pay 100 shillings. If someone breaks another man's jaw, let him pay 20 shillings. But embedded within the text are specific protections for the church. A fine of 12 shillings for harming a church servant. Higher compensation for damaging property that belonged to the church or clergy. Recognition of holy places as sacrosanct. These may seem minor, but they represent a paradigm shift. Before, law was about vengeance and honor. Under Ethelbert, it became about order, hierarchy, and sacred boundaries. His code influenced later English kings Alfred, Ini, Edmund, and others who continued to merge Christian values with secular governance. A model of royal piety. Ethelbert's posthumous reputation became that of a model Christian monarch. Later chroniclers praised his balance of power and piety. Bede, writing in the 8th century, depicted him as a wise and moderate ruler who accepted the faith not in weakness, but in strength. This was crucial. For Christianity to thrive among the Saxons, it needed to be seen not as submission to a foreign god, but as an elevation, a more refined, divine kind of authority. Ethelbert's model provided this. He converted without coercion, protected both pagans and Christians under law, supported churches materially but ruled politically. He was neither zealot nor indifferent. He normalized Christian kingship in a warrior society, no small feat. Legacy in Kent and beyond. After Ethelbert's death, his son Eadbald briefly rejected Christianity. This created a crisis. Missionaries fled, churches closed. Augustine's successor, Lawrence, considered abandoning the entire mission. But the strength of Ethelbert's institutions held. Within a year, Eadbald reconverted, possibly influenced by a vision or counsel from church leaders. The missionaries returned. The churches reopened. And Christianity, though shaken, had proven resilient. The legacy extended beyond Kent. The King of Essex, a relative of Ethelbert, had been baptized earlier during Ethelbert's life. The model of Christian kingship encouraged later rulers in Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia to adopt the faith, often through royal marriage, as Ethelbert himself had done. Thus a precedent was born. Queens brought the faith and kings adopted it strategically. Ethelbert and Bertha became the template. The afterlife of a Christian king. Ethelbert was buried in St. Augustine's Abbey, beside Queen Bertha and later Augustine himself. The site became a place of pilgrimage and memory, a symbol of the faith's return to Britain. By the 9th century, Ethelbert was venerated as a saint, not for martyrdom, not for miracles, but for what he represented, the first English king to embrace the new faith peacefully. His feast day, February 24, was observed in later medieval calendars. And still, his influence was quiet. He was not remembered with relics or dramatic visions. His sainthood was political, structural, institutional, much like his reign. A partnership remembered. It is tempting to separate Ethelbert's achievement from Bertha's quiet work, but that would be a mistake. Together, they bridged a chasm between cultures. Frankish and Saxon, Roman and Germanic, pagan and Christian. Bertha prepared the court for faith. Ethelbert gave it legal standing and royal dignity. Their story is a rare one in early medieval Europe, a joint religious transformation achieved not through violence, but through mutual respect, diplomacy, and deliberate change. The seeds they planted. The Church in England would go on to face schism, war, Viking invasions, and Norman conquest, but the roots it grew starting in Ethelbert's reign remained. Canterbury became the heart of English Christianity. St. Martin's Church, where Bertha once prayed, is still in use today. The law code of Ethelbert remains the earliest written expression of English civil and ecclesiastical identity. And their marriage, a union of political strategy and spiritual consequence, helped reintroduce Christianity to an island that had almost forgotten it. Final reflection. In a world obsessed with conquest and bloodline, Ethelbert and Bertha offered something different: conversion by coexistence, power tempered by patience, and faith grounded in governance. They did not burn down temples. They did not exile druids or force baptism under the sword. They simply opened a door and stood beside it until others chose to walk through. Their story ends not in drama, but in legacy. Which leads us to ask, in a history filled with kings who fought to leave their mark in stone and blood, is it not remarkable that one of the most lasting transformations came from those who ruled with restraint and let the world change around them, gently? Story 4. The Monastery at Canterbury, Building Faith by Hand. It begins with a wall. A stone wall, likely Roman in origin, crumbling under centuries of neglect. Weeds growing in its cracks, ivy stretching across it like green veins. A relic of a dead empire, now pressed into service by a new one, the Christian Church. It is the early 7th century, and in Canterbury, men in rough robes move slowly in silence. They clear stones, draw up plans, and whisper prayers. These are monks, and what they are building is no fortress, no palace, no market, but a monastery, a place not of war or wealth, but of worship and work. This is St. Augustine's Abbey, one of the first Christian monastic houses in Anglo-Saxon England. It was not just a center of faith. It was a crucible of culture, a place where ideas, scripts, languages, and identities were shaped. In this story, we enter the quiet world of these first monks, the daily life they lived, the tools they used, and the legacy they left layered stone by stone. A different kind of power. In the kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons, power was measured in land, swords, and alliances. But the monastery introduced a new kind of authority, the authority of silence, learning, and endurance. Augustine of Canterbury, before his death in 604, had received a royal grant from King Ethelbert land to build a monastic community just outside the city walls. It was meant to be more than just housing for monks. It would serve as a training center, burial ground, and symbol of Christianity's permanence. But for the first monks who arrived here, there were no marble columns or golden altars. There were ruins, mud, and timber. They began with what they had: monastic architecture, reusing the bones of Rome. Early construction was practical. The Roman structures still standing in Canterbury provided ready-made stone, even if their roofs had fallen in. Roads leading to the old town could be cleared. Roman bricks were carefully scavenged and repurposed. The initial buildings were likely modest. A chapel, probably wooden at first, later rebuilt in stone. Cloisters, open courtyards where monks would walk and pray. A dormitory, where they slept side by side on simple straw beds. A refectory, where meals were taken in silence. Eventually, a scriptorium was added, a workshop for copying texts. This was essential. Books were rare, and every gospel, psalter, or homily had to be copied by hand, letter by letter, onto sheets of vellum made from animal hides. This work, slow, repetitive, and grueling, was seen as an act of devotion. To copy a single Bible could take years. The daily life of a monk. The monks of Canterbury followed a strict routine, modeled on the rule of St. Benedict, which was spreading from the continent. Their day was divided into fixed hours of prayer, work, study, and rest. Here is what a day might look like. Before dawn, matins and lauds. The day began in darkness. Monks woke, often in unheated stone buildings, and filed into the chapel for matins, night prayers, and lauds just before sunrise. These were chanted in Latin, following the Psalms. Morning, manual labor or script work. After a simple breakfast, bread and ale perhaps, the monks went to their assigned tasks. Some worked in the gardens or fields. Others tended livestock. The more educated copied texts, illuminating them with delicate ink drawings. Midday Mass and Sext. The central prayer of the day was the Mass, held at a small stone altar. It was often attended by laypeople from the town. The Sext, or noon prayer, followed. Afternoon study or teaching. Some monks taught boys from the local area, sons of nobility destined for the church. Others studied Latin grammar, scripture, or the writings of the church fathers. Evening, vespers, and supper. Before supper, they gathered for vespers, the evening prayer. Meals were silent, accompanied by a monk reading from scripture or lives of saints. Night Compline. As darkness fell, the monks said their final prayers. They returned to their dormitory and slept until they were called again in the early hours of the next day. This cycle repeated every day, every season, every year. It was, in every sense, boring, but it was in this boredom that Christian England was being built. The labor of illumination. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Canterbury's monastery lies not in its stones, but in its manuscripts. The scriptorium was the heart of monastic learning. Here, scribes hunched over wooden desks, quills in hand, copying not only the Gospels, but also letters from Rome, commentaries, calendars, and even legal texts. The ink was made from oak galls, the pens from goose feathers. The pigments came from plants, minerals, and rare imported substances. Each page required preparation of vellum, often made from calf skin, ruling lines with a stylus, careful transcription in Latin script, illumination or decoration with gold leaf and colored inks, binding into wooden covers, sometimes reinforced with leather or iron. To finish one gospel book could take months or years. But each completed book was a treasure, not just a tool, but a sacred object. Through this labor, Latin literacy was preserved in England. The monastery became not only a place of prayer, but a repository of knowledge, a school, and a publisher. A burial ground for kings. St. Augustine's Abbey soon became the royal mausoleum of Kentish kings. King Ethelbert and Queen Bertha were buried here. So too were many of Augustine's successors, bishops and abbots. Their tombs were marked with inscriptions, some in Latin, carved into stone. For a time, this abbey became the most sacred burial place in England, a symbol that Christian kingship and monastic Christianity were now intertwined. To be buried at St. Augustine was not just a spiritual honor, it was a political statement. I am a king not only of land and law but also of God. The monastery and the town. The monks of Canterbury were not entirely isolated. They interacted with laypeople teaching, offering alms, treating the sick, baptizing and hosting travelers. Their abbey offered a stable institution in a volatile world. As kingdoms rose and fell, monasteries remained. They kept records, stored grain, preserved treaties, and sometimes even served as diplomatic centers. In time, other monasteries would be founded across England, modeled on Canterbury's example places like Jarrow, Lindisfarne, Glastonbury, and Malmesbury. But it started here with Augustine's monks, Bertha's quiet prayers, and the enduring vision of a king who had opened the door. A monastery of quiet influence. Unlike cathedrals or castles, the monastery was not built to impress. It was built to endure. Its silence spoke louder than proclamation. Its order provided an alternative to the chaos of tribal warfare. Its Latin script connected England to the larger world of Christendom. In time, the Venerable Bede would write the story of England's conversion. The Synod of Whitby would unify the church, and kings and queens would come and go. But Canterbury's monastery, founded in mud and silence, would remain. A final thought. The monks who built St. Augustine's Abbey were not remembered by name. They left no sagas, no grand speeches, no monuments to themselves. They lived quiet lives, wrote quiet words, and shaped a quiet revolution. And in doing so, they helped turn a warrior people into a literate Christian nation. So we ask, is it not remarkable that a kingdom built on the blade could be transformed, not by force, but by men with pens, prayers, and the patience to stack one stone upon another, day after day, expecting nothing in return but silence? By the early decades of the 7th century, St. Augustine's Abbey had grown from a humble group of huts into a working monastery, a place of quiet influence just outside the Roman walls of Canterbury. Built on land granted by a king, sustained by the prayers and labor of monks, and guided by customs centuries old, the abbey was a living embodiment of the Christian vision for England. But its greatest work was not its stone walls or buried kings. It was order. In a world still ruled by seasonal cycles, oral tradition, tribal loyalties, and the uncertainties of politics and plague, monastic life offered structure, memory, and a model for stability. Not loudly, not dramatically, but day by day, through routine and ritual. This section explores how that monastic order worked not just within the walls of the abbey, but in its rippling effects on a changing nation. A rule for life. The monks of Canterbury followed a structured way of life known as the Rule of St. Benedict, a 6th century guide for monastic discipline that emphasized humility, obedience, prayer, and labor. It was not unique to England. Benedictine rules were spreading across Europe, but in the early English context, this was revolutionary. Here, in a kingdom where chieftains ruled through oaths and raids, a new kind of authority was being modeled: voluntary submission to community, the discipline of silence, and the idea that time itself could be sanctified. Key principles of the Benedictine rule. Obedience to the abbot, who ruled not by lineage or wealth, but by spiritual maturity. Stability, with monks committing to live their entire lives in the same community. Conversion of life, not just through belief but through continuous action: how one ate, slept, spoke, worked, and prayed. This meant that the monastery was more than a residence. It was a school of the soul, where every action was sacred if performed in humility and devotion. Time made sacred. One of the most radical ideas the monastery introduced was the regulation of time. The day was not left to whim or weather. It was broken into canonical hours, each marked by prayer, chant, or bell. Matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime early morning, terce mid-morning, sext noon, none mid-afternoon, vespers sunset, compline before bed. These prayer services divided the day into predictable intervals, where monks stopped whatever task they were doing and gathered for worship. Even sleep, meals, and silence were governed by the bell. For most Anglo-Saxons, whose lives followed the sun, the seasons, and the needs of livestock, this level of structure was foreign. But for those who encountered the monastery, from nobles to servants to future kings, it was deeply compelling. Here was a place where order triumphed over chaos every day. Hospitality in the outside world. Though cloistered, the monastery was not a fortress. The rule of Saint Benedict required monks to be hospitable to strangers, especially the poor and the traveler. In a time of minimal infrastructure, monasteries became known as safe places on long, dangerous roads. Travelers might arrive seeking food, shelter, or healing. They would be welcomed at the guest house, their feet washed, their meals served without charge. In some cases, they might overhear the monks singing psalms in Latin, a haunting sound for those who knew only the rhythmic poetry of Saxon tongues. This practice of Christian hospitality slowly shaped the reputation of the Church. It wasn't only about sermons or doctrine. It was about actions repeated, without fanfare, in every monastery across the land. A sick farmer, a hungry child, a lost noble. They would all be fed not because they were powerful, but because they were human. The monastery as a model of literacy. Literacy in 7th century England was rare. Most of the population, nobles included, relied on oral communication, memory, and the spoken word. But inside the monastery, words were written, copied, studied, and preserved. The monks at Canterbury copied Scripture, especially the Latin Vulgate Bible. Lives of the saints, particularly those of Roman and Gallic origin. Letters from the Pope, which connected England to the broader Christian world. Legal documents, including land grants and law codes. Educational texts, such as Latin grammar manuals. These books were handmade, each one requiring weeks or months of labor. The script used, known as uncial or insular minuscule, was carefully chosen, designed for clarity and longevity. Monks who trained in these skills became the first educators of Anglo-Saxon children, particularly those destined for clerical roles. Sons of kings and nobles were sometimes sent to monasteries for this reason, not to become monks, necessarily, but to become literate. Canterbury, in this way, became the first schoolhouse of Christian England. Ritual and the rewriting of the sacred. The Saxon world was one of ritual but not Christian ritual. Seasonal festivals, funerary feasts, oaths sworn by swords, and rites held in sacred groves were deeply ingrained in daily life. The monastery introduced new rituals, slower and less theatrical, but equally potent. The Mass with its altar, candles, and consecrated bread. Processions, in which monks walked in order through town on holy days. Burials, where the dead were laid to rest in hallowed ground, accompanied by prayer, not weapons. Over time, these rituals began to replace or reshape the old ones. A spring once sacred to a nature deity might become a holy well dedicated to a saint. A day once marked by harvest celebration might now be a feast day. The monastery didn't destroy the old world. It absorbed it, giving it new meaning. Monks as diplomats and record keepers. Because of their literacy and training, monks were often called upon to write letters, witness treaties, and serve as scribes in legal matters. They wrote for kings. They preserved royal genealogies. They kept track of land disputes and boundaries. Their presence brought credibility. A land grant with a monastic seal carried moral and legal weight. A marriage witnessed by monks was harder to dispute. In this way, the monastery slowly became part of the governance of England, not through power, but through presence. It recorded what others would forget: women and the monastic ideal. Although St. Augustine's Abbey was a male house, its influence reached women as well. Christian queens, noblewomen, and widows began to found or support female monasteries, modeled after Canterbury. These places offered women literacy, spiritual authority, and a life outside marriage. Abbesses such as Hild of Whitby would rise to become leaders of entire religious communities, holding councils, advising kings, and guiding future bishops. This quiet transformation had its roots in the monastic structures established in places like Canterbury. Change without conflict. Perhaps most remarkably, the monastery succeeded in transforming the culture without erasing it. Its monks did not tear down Saxon halls or demand mass conversions. They simply lived differently, and over time, that difference spread. Their predictability was their power. In an age of instability, people began to trust the monks. They were there in birth and death, in famine and harvest, in storm and sun. Where other institutions failed, the monastery remained. A final thought. As the 7th century continued, more monasteries would rise. More kings would convert. More books would be written. But Canterbury was the seed, the first place where prayer and parchment, humility and labor came together to shape a new society. And so we're left with a question that history does not answer directly. Did the monks of Canterbury know what they were doing? Did they understand that by organizing their days around bells and psalms, by copying one gospel at a time, they were not merely surviving but rewriting the future of an entire people? By the middle of the 7th century, St. Augustine's Abbey was no longer just a construction site on the edge of a Roman city. It had become something more, a center of continuity in a land still finding its spiritual footing. While kings rose and fell, and missionary work pushed north into pagan kingdoms, the quiet hum of monastic life in Canterbury continued. Its bells rang with regularity. Its walls thickened with history. And within its cloistered spaces, a culture was being crafted, piece by piece, with parchment, prayer, and perseverance. This final section explores how Canterbury's monastery endured, what legacy it left behind, and how its influence extended far beyond what the early monks could ever have imagined. A sacred burial ground. By the time of King Eadbald's conversion, Ethelbert's son, who had initially returned to paganism, St. Augustine's Abbey had already become the royal mausoleum of Kent. It would remain so for centuries. King Ethelbert, the first Christian king in Anglo-Saxon England, was buried there. His queen, Bertha, whose quiet faith made the mission possible, lay beside him. Augustine, the reluctant missionary turned archbishop, was interred there in humility. His successors, bishops and abbots alike, followed. These tombs, marked by Latin inscriptions and simple carvings, became touchstones of memory, places where the present could look back to the recent past, and where pilgrims came to feel the presence of holiness in the dust. Canterbury became, quietly and steadily, a holy city, not by blood or fire but by burial and bell. A pattern for other monasteries. As Christianity spread across England from Lindisfarne in the north to Glastonbury in the west, Canterbury stood as a model. Monasteries that followed looked to Canterbury for liturgical practices, the order of services, the arrangement of prayers, the calendar of feasts. Script standards, the use of Latin uncials, manuscript formatting, and decorative borders. Architectural forms, cloisters, refectories, and dormitories. Legal precedents, land ownership, monastic immunity, and burial rites. This influence was not always enforced. It was organic, arising from reputation, age, and association with Rome. Canterbury became a kind of ecclesiastical elder sibling, not commanding, but respected. The monastery and the archbishopric. Though Augustine's mission began modestly, his seat at Canterbury grew into the spiritual heart of the English Church. Every archbishop that followed him was based in or closely tied to the monastic community. The abbey provided liturgical support for the cathedral, training and housing for young clergy, copyists and scribes for official church documents, a physical reminder of the origins of English Christianity. The Archbishop of Canterbury, a title that survives even today, owes its prestige not only to Augustine's mission, but to the institutional backbone provided by the abbey. Without the monastery, the archbishopric would have been a title without substance. Monasteries as memory keepers. In a land where oral tradition once reigned, monasteries preserved a new kind of memory, written, chronological, and preserved in books. Canterbury's monks recorded royal genealogies of Kentish kings, charters and land grants written in Latin and Old English, ecclesiastical records, including the names of bishops and abbots, hagiographies or lives of saints meant to inspire the faithful. These documents became sources for future historians like the Venerable Bede, who relied on Canterbury's records to tell the story of England's conversion. In a very real way, the history of the English Church exists today because monks like those at Canterbury copied, stored, and protected it. Even when fires, wars, and reforms swept across the land, some of these manuscripts survived. Others, lost to time, still echo in the references of later texts. Surviving in times of trouble. St. Augustine's Abbey was not untouched by conflict. Over the centuries it faced plagues which decimated monastic populations, political upheavals, including rivalries between kings and church leaders, Viking raids, especially in the 9th century, which led to the sacking and burning of many monastic centers. And yet Canterbury survived. Its location, close to continental Europe, made it easier to rebuild and resupply. Its status, as the heart of English Christianity, offered it protection and priority, and its monastic discipline ensured that rebuilding began quickly. Every time it faltered, it rose again, not necessarily in grandeur, but in function. As the rest of the world fractured and changed, Canterbury endured through repetition, record-keeping, and the daily rhythm of the rule. The monastery and national identity. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, the monastery had stood for nearly 500 years. In that time, the Saxons had become Christians, the Roman and Celtic churches had reconciled, and England had become a nation defined in part by its religion. And yet, in the face of massive political change, the monastery remained. To the Normans, it was a link to English legitimacy. To the English, it was a symbol of spiritual independence. And though the original monks were long dead, their work lived on. In the Latin phrases spoken in courtrooms, in the calendar of feasts observed by farmers and kings, in the very idea that a king could not rule without spiritual guidance. The sound of bells. In the end, the monastery was not a place of drama or spectacle. Its most powerful symbol was the bell rung 8 times a day, not for alarm, but for prayer. This sound marked time itself, gave it structure, and reminded both monk and layperson that life was to be lived with intention. The bell called the scribe from his ink, the gardener from his spade, the novice from his studies, the traveler from the road. It said, pause, pray, remember. And long after the monks who rang them were gone, the rhythm remained in the order of schools, in the chimes of churches, in the sense that days should begin and end with something more than labor. Final reflection. St. Augustine's Abbey was not the most magnificent building in Anglo-Saxon England. It wasn't the richest. It didn't host battles or change the course of politics with proclamations. But it built something far more enduring, a way of life. It taught that structure could be sacred, that repetition could be holy, and that faith could be quiet and still change a nation. So as we close this story, we ask, what legacy is greater, the crown of a king who conquers lands, or the parchment of a monk who copies words that will outlast empires? Story 5. The Conversion of Northumbria, Paulinus and Edwin. It is the early 7th century, and the kingdom of Northumbria lies cold and proud in the north of what would one day become England. It is a land of fierce warbands, wooden halls hung with iron weapons, and sprawling heaths broken only by hill forts and smoke. Here the gods are still those of the ancestors. Woden, Thunor, and Tiel watch over warriors. Sacrifice is made to preserve victory. Oaths are bound in blood. And yet, in this land of fire and steel, a question is beginning to whisper its way into courtly conversations. Is there another way to live? That question will come to define the rule of King Edwin of Northumbria. His story is one of war, exile, diplomacy, and finally, conversion. But it does not begin in a cathedral. It begins in fear. A king in exile. Before Edwin became king, he was a refugee. His father Aella was killed when Edwin was still young, and the throne of Dara, one half of what would later become Northumbria, was seized by a rival, Ethelfrith, king of Bernicia. Edwin was forced into exile, moving between the courts of other kings, relying on their hospitality, living with the knowledge that his very presence put his hosts in danger. He wandered, he waited, he learned. One of the courts that harbored him was in East Anglia, under King Redwald, a powerful overlord and a man straddling two worlds. Redwald had been baptized, but he also kept altars to the old gods. He was, in a sense, both Christian and pagan, and he allowed his guests to observe the new faith if they chose. It was here that Edwin began to encounter the cross, not as an enemy's banner, but as an idea. The man called Paulinus. In Redwald's court, a man named Paulinus served quietly. He was a Roman monk, sent by Pope Gregory I as part of Augustine's broader mission. Unlike Augustine, Paulinus had no secure post or thriving community. He was a bishop without a seat, a teacher without students. But he watched Edwin. And as the years passed and Edwin's prospects improved, Paulinus was assigned a task. If Edwin should ever become king of Northumbria, he was to bring him to Christianity. It seemed unlikely. Edwin was a pagan, Northumbria was divided, and the path to the throne would be blood-soaked. But history is made by unlikely events. The return to power. Redwald eventually decided to intervene in Northumbrian politics. In 616, he raised an army, marched north, and defeated Ethelfrith in battle. Edwin was restored as king not just of Dara, but of a united Northumbria. For the first time, the two northern realms were ruled by one man. Paulinus followed him north. But Edwin's court remained pagan. Paulinus was tolerated but not welcomed. He was a foreigner, a Roman, a man whose god had no place in the northern sagas. His prayers were heard but not heeded. Edwin, now powerful, had little reason to change. Until fear found him again. The dream and the assassin. Bede tells the story like this. One night, Edwin sat alone, contemplating the threats against him. A mysterious stranger entered his hall, placed his hand on Edwin's head, and promised him future greatness if only he would listen to the voice of truth. When Edwin awoke, he told no one. But later, when an assassin sent by a rival king attempted to kill him, and Paulinus protected the court through prayer, Edwin remembered the vision. He began to wonder whether his reign might not be secure without divine aid. Soon after, Paulinus revealed that he had knowledge of the vision, knowledge no outsider could have. and Edwin began to listen. The Queen's role. Another piece in this puzzle was Edwin's marriage. He had wed Ethelbert of Kent, a Christian princess and daughter of King Ethelbert, the same man who had supported Augustine's mission in the south. Ethelbert brought with her a small Christian household, and importantly Paulinus as her chaplain. As in Kent with Bertha, so now in Northumbria, a Christian queen brought the church into a pagan court, not with fire or condemnation, but with calm, consistent witness. Edwin agreed that she could continue her religion, and that their children would be baptized. Still, he himself remained uncommitted. The old gods still had power, and a king who rejected them too quickly risked alienating his warriors, his priests, and his allies. The Council of the Witan. Before converting, Edwin did what kings of the time often did. He called his Witan, his council of nobles and priests. He asked them, should we abandon the old gods and accept this new faith? One of the most powerful responses came from a noble who said, "The present life of man upon earth, O king, seems to me, in comparison with that which is unknown to us, like the swift flight of a sparrow through the house, as he comes in at one door and flies out at another. While he is inside, he is safe from the winter storms. But when he has passed out of the house, he returns to the darkness from which he came. So this life of man appears for a little while, but of what is to follow or what went before we know nothing." This parable, drawn from everyday experience, captured the uncertainty of human life and the hope that Christianity offered something more. In the end, the council approved. The baptism of a king. On Easter Day, 627, in the city of York, Edwin was baptized in a wooden church built quickly for the occasion. The location would later become York Minster, one of the most important ecclesiastical centers in England. With him, many nobles and warriors were also baptized. It was a symbolic moment. Christianity was no longer confined to Kent or foreign princesses, it had reached the powerful north. For Paulinus, it was a victory long in the making. Aftermath and expansion. Following Edwin's conversion, Paulinus was made Bishop of York. New churches were built in Lincoln, York, and other northern towns. Edwin sent letters to the Pope requesting recognition and support. Paulinus baptized thousands, sometimes entire villages at once, often in rivers. But the hold of Christianity in Northumbria was not yet secure. Just a few years later, Edwin would die in battle against the pagan king Penda of Mercia. Paulinus would flee south, churches would be destroyed, converts would waver. And yet the seed had been planted. A kingdom between gods. Edwin's story is not one of seamless transition. It is a story of hesitation, fear, vision, and gradual persuasion. His conversion was political, personal, and spiritual all at once. Christianity did not erase the old gods in a single generation. It lived beside them for a time, one sparrow flying through the hall, while others lingered outside. But Edwin's reign showed that kingship and Christianity could coexist, even in the north, and that was enough. For now, the baptism of King Edwin of Northumbria on Easter Sunday, 627 AD, marked a milestone in the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England. It had taken years of diplomacy, marriage alliances, visions, and careful persuasion. With Edwin's public conversion in York, Christianity had gained a royal patron far beyond the borders of Kent. But as with many transformations in history, the shift was not smooth nor secure. This section explores what followed Edwin's conversion, the rise of new Christian structures in the north, the mission's expansion under Paulinus, and the fragility of it all when pagan resistance returned with a vengeance. A church of timber and hope. Edwin was baptized in a hastily constructed wooden church, one of the first Christian buildings in the north. It was humble wooden beams, simple thatching, a stone altar perhaps, but symbolically immense. It was later replaced with stone, becoming the foundation for what we now know as York Minster. From this small beginning, Edwin and Bishop Paulinus launched a northern mission. Churches were built in York, Lincoln, and Catarictonium, modern-day Catterick. Roads once used by Roman legions now carried itinerant bishops and priests. Royal estates were used to host mass baptisms, often conducted in rivers. Christianity began to spread to the common people, not just the court. But unlike the missions in Kent or East Anglia, the Christianization of Northumbria had farther to go and more to resist. Paulinus the preacher. Paulinus was not a flashy missionary. According to Bede, he was tall, thin, and solemn, with a stoop and a quiet presence. But he preached with conviction, and he knew how to adapt his message to the local culture. He traveled extensively, often on horseback, accompanied by a small group of clergy and lay helpers. When he preached in villages, he offered baptism and basic catechism. He worked slowly but deliberately, building not just belief but trust. One of Paulinus's successes was the conversion of Edwin's daughter, Eanfled, whom he baptized on Whitsunday in 626. This event occurred even before Edwin himself converted, marking a small but significant victory. The baptism of royal children helped tie the church to dynastic continuity, a vital tactic in a culture where lineage and legitimacy were everything. Resistance from within. Despite Edwin's baptism, not everyone in his kingdom embraced the new religion. Many of his earls, thanes, and local priests continued to serve the old gods in private. Some paid lip service to Christianity while maintaining pagan rites for the harvest, fertility, or battle. The Witan may have approved the king's baptism, but that did not guarantee full ideological alignment. For ordinary people, too, the shift was disorienting. Christianity asked them to abandon animal sacrifices, sacred groves and wells, seasonal festivals tied to agricultural rhythms, the ancestral gods of their fathers. In exchange, they were offered an unfamiliar god, foreign priests, and Latin prayers. It would take generations, not months, to truly root Christianity in the culture. Alliances and fragility. Edwin, newly Christian and ambitious, now looked to secure alliances with other kingdoms both politically and religiously. He became the most powerful king in England, even claiming the title of Bretwalda Overlord. But this rise in power put him on a collision course with other pagan rulers, most notably Penda of Mercia, a fierce traditionalist and military leader; Cadwallon of Gwynedd, a Christian by baptism but hostile to Saxon overlordship. Together, Penda and Cadwallon formed an unlikely alliance, pagan and Christian, united more by political resistance to Edwin's dominance than by religion. But their coalition would prove devastating to Edwin's mission. The Battle of Hatfield Chase. In October 633, the coalition struck. Edwin's forces met the armies of Penda and Cadwallon at Hatfield Chase, likely near modern-day Doncaster. The battle was bloody, brutal, and decisive. Edwin was killed. His eldest son, Osfrith, died with him. His youngest son, Eadfrith, was captured and eventually killed by Penda. Queen Ethelbar, with her children and Paulinus, fled back to Kent. With Edwin dead, Christian structures in Northumbria collapsed almost overnight. Churches were destroyed, priests were expelled or killed, converts were harassed or silenced. Cadwallon's campaign became notorious for its ferocity. He spared neither Christian nor pagan in his vengeance. Paulinus, who had worked tirelessly in the north, was forced to retreat. He was made Bishop of Rochester, but never returned to York. The mission that had taken years to build disappeared in days. Seeds in the ashes. And yet Christianity was not entirely lost. The memory of Edwin's reign and baptism lingered. The royal family, including Eanfled, survived in Kent, where she was raised Christian. Some converts held to their new faith in secret. The idea of Christian kingship had been planted. When Edwin's nephew, Oswald, returned from exile in the next generation, he would build upon the foundations laid by Edwin and Paulinus, but with new allies and new missionaries. For now, the Christian experiment in Northumbria had failed politically, but it had succeeded in proving that conversion was possible, even in the most warrior-dominated kingdoms. Paulinus's quiet legacy. Though he never returned to the north, Paulinus continued his service in Kent. He was a bishop, then an archbishop. He built churches. He ministered to Queen Ethelbar and her household. He helped preserve the fragile chain of Christian continuity that would be needed in the decades to come. He died in 644, largely forgotten in the north where his greatest efforts had occurred. But Bede, writing a century later, remembered him kindly. He was a man of great piety and religion, laboring day and night in teaching and baptizing. History often remembers the bold, the dramatic, the victorious. Paulinus was none of these. But without him, the Christianization of England would have lost one of its earliest and most tireless builders. A kingdom between crossroads. The story of Edwin and Paulinus is not one of triumph, but of trial. It reminds us that conversion, whether spiritual, cultural, or political, is never a straight line. It weaves through vision and violence, hope and defeat. The first efforts often fall. The first missionaries are often buried in obscurity. But they prepare the way. And so we end this section with a question. Is a mission truly a failure if it plants seeds that others will later harvest? The body of King Edwin lay somewhere in the marshes of Hatfield Chase, his once-proud banner trampled underfoot. The fledgling churches he built were shattered or burned. And Bishop Paulinus, the man who had baptized a northern king and thousands of his subjects, was far from the land he had once dreamed would be England's spiritual frontier. Yet, as in so many of history's quieter turns, defeat was not the end. This section explores the long echo of Paulinus's mission, the legacy of Edwin's conversion, and how a brief, faltering moment of Christianity in Northumbria became the soil from which something far stronger would grow. A mission's afterlife. At first glance, the failure of Edwin's reign might seem total. His sons were dead or exiled. His kingdom was fractured, split between feuding warlords. Christianity was violently rejected, at least by those who resented it as a royal imposition. But history is not only shaped by victory, it is shaped by memory. In the south, Queen Ethelbar returned to Kent with her children, including the young Eanfled, whom Paulinus had baptized as an infant. There, Eanfled would be raised in the Christian faith, sheltered by a court that had already lived through one cycle of conversion and crisis. Paulinus, now Bishop of Rochester, remained a living witness of that northern experiment. He corresponded with other clergy, he shared stories, and he ensured that the records of what had happened in Northumbria were preserved. The early English church, in its fragile infancy, had learned an essential lesson. Conversion required not just kings, but continuity. The return of faith with Oswald. In the aftermath of Edwin's death, Northumbria descended into chaos. But out of that darkness emerged a new figure, Oswald, a nephew of Edwin, who had spent his youth in exile on the island of Iona, off the western coast of Scotland. There, Oswald encountered a different kind of Christianity, Celtic rather than Roman in form, but no less devout. When Oswald returned to reclaim his kingdom, he did so not only with a sword but with a cross. Before the Battle of Heavenfield, 634, he planted a wooden cross in the earth and prayed with his men. He invited the monk Aidan from Iona to establish a new Christian center at Lindisfarne. Under Oswald, Christianity returned to Northumbria, not as the project of southern missionaries, but as a native part of its royal lineage. This second wave of conversion was gentler, more rooted in local customs, and more successful. But none of it would have been possible without the first seeds sown by Edwin and Paulinus. The legacy of Edwin. Though his reign was short, Edwin was remembered. His daughter Eanfled became a queen herself and later an abbess, playing a central role in the early church. He was venerated as a saint, particularly in northern monasteries like Whitby. His tomb became a pilgrimage site, and his memory was invoked in political claims of legitimacy by later Northumbrian kings. Bede, writing decades later, described Edwin's reign as one of justice and order, noting that in his time, a woman with her newborn child might walk throughout the island from sea to sea and take no harm. It is hard to separate legend from history, but this image of safety, peace, and dignity is how Edwin was remembered. And in that memory, Christianity gained something vital, a royal role model. Paulinus's final years. Paulinus never returned to the north, but his work continued in the south. In Rochester, he served as bishop for over a decade. He helped oversee the training of young clergy, the management of Christian estates, the continuation of liturgical practices introduced during Augustine's mission. He died in 644 and was later venerated as a saint. Though never as famous as Augustine or Aidan, Paulinus holds a unique place in history. The first bishop of York, the first evangelist to northern kings, and the bridge between Roman and Celtic missions. Where others planted and saw fruit, Paulinus planted and saw failure, but his seeds bore fruit long after he was gone. The question of paganism. Even after Edwin and Oswald, the old gods did not vanish overnight. Pagan shrines continued in remote villages. Some warriors returned to ancestral rites before battle. Seasonal festivals like Yule or Easter retained their pagan names and practices long after being Christianized. But the language of Christianity, introduced by Paulinus and others, slowly replaced the vocabulary of the old ways. Crosses replaced carved totems. Latin prayers replaced ritual chants. Churches became the new centers of community, rather than mead halls. And most importantly, kingship and Christianity were now intertwined. No ruler could claim to be fully legitimate without at least public alignment with the church. Historical ripples. The story of Edwin and Paulinus is one of the most vivid examples of how early medieval Christianity advanced not by conquest, but by charisma, marriage, memory, and mourning. And its influence is lasting. The Archbishopric of York, first held by Paulinus, became one of two pillars of the English Church, alongside Canterbury. The Synod of Whitby, 664, which later aligned English Christianity with Roman customs, featured leaders who were descendants biological and spiritual of Edwin's court. The very idea of an English church, rather than a patchwork of tribal chapels, has its roots in these early royal conversions. And all of this came from a fragile mission, interrupted by violence but preserved by storytelling. Final reflection. The conversion of Northumbria is not just about a king and a bishop. It is a story of how beliefs take root in difficult soil, how loss does not erase meaning, and how quiet persistence matters more than early success. Paulinus did not stay to see his mission flourish. Edwin did not live to enjoy the full fruits of his new faith. But because they acted, later generations had a path to follow. So we ask, is it possible that the greatest influence we leave is not what we accomplish, but what we begin knowing we may never see it finished? Story 6, Lindisfarne and the Age of Saints. Just off the rugged northeastern coast of Northumbria lies a tidal island, reachable only at low tide along a natural causeway. Today, it's called Lindisfarne, but in the 7th century, it was known as the Holy Island, and for good reason. It was the cradle of northern English Christianity, a site of sanctity, scholarship, and monastic simplicity that helped transform Anglo-Saxon England. Yet its story begins not with peace, but with war. This section tells the origin of Lindisfarne's monastic community, the legacy of King Oswald, and the gentle, deliberate mission of Aidan of Iona, a monk who chose humility over conquest, and whose legacy would echo for centuries. A king's return from exile. After the death of King Edwin at the hands of Penda of Mercia and Cadwallon of Gwynedd, Northumbria was broken. The Christian mission appeared destroyed. Churches were abandoned. Priests fled or were killed. The new faith, for a time, seemed extinguished. But one member of Edwin's extended family had survived the political catastrophe: his nephew, Oswald. Oswald had fled to Iona, a monastic island off the coast of western Scotland. There, he was not only given sanctuary, he was converted, baptized, and trained in Christian doctrine by Celtic monks of the Columban tradition. While southern England aligned itself with the Roman Church, Iona and the north followed a different path, a more austere, community-focused Celtic Christianity, influenced by St. Columba, who had established the monastery there in 563. It was here, in exile, that Oswald not only found faith but found his calling. The battle in the cross. In 634, Oswald returned to Northumbria. His rival Cadwallon was still ravaging the region. Before battle, Oswald did something remarkable. He raised a wooden cross, had it blessed, and prayed with his warriors. He asked for God's protection not just over his troops, but over his people. The next day at the Battle of Heavenfield, Oswald won a decisive victory. Cadwallon was killed. Northumbria was reunited. For the first time since Edwin, a Christian king ruled the north, but this time, one deeply shaped by the Celtic Church. Aidan comes to Northumbria. Having secured the throne, Oswald looked to rebuild the Christian mission. But instead of recalling Paulinus, who had retreated to Kent, Oswald sent to Iona for help. A missionary named Corman was sent, but his approach was stern, harsh, and ineffective. He returned to Iona, frustrated. A young monk named Aidan, present at Corman's report, gently suggested a different approach. "Perhaps you were too harsh with an unlearned people. Should you not have offered them first the milk of gentler teaching?" The leaders at Iona agreed. Aidan was sent in Corman's place. The founding of Lindisfarne. In 635, Aidan arrived in Northumbria. King Oswald gave him Lindisfarne, a tidal island near the royal fortress of Bamburgh, but isolated enough to suit a monastic lifestyle. The island was ideal. It was cut off by the tide twice, daily, physically and spiritually separate. It had rich fishing grounds and nearby farmland. It was visible from the royal seat, yet secluded from courtly distractions. There, Aidan and a small group of monks founded a monastery built of timber and thatch, humble and sparse. It became a center of prayer, teaching, and missionary outreach. Aidan's missionary style. Aidan was not a grand preacher. He spoke only Irish and Latin at first, so King Oswald often served as his translator, walking alongside him as he journeyed through Northumbria. Unlike Paulinus, Aidan traveled on foot rather than on horseback. He visited towns and villages, stopping to talk with peasants, children, and servants. His method was slow but effective. He converted small communities, not just elites. He trained Anglo-Saxon boys to become future priests and missionaries. He established schools in Lindisfarne for Latin, scripture, and sacred music. He was generous with the poor, giving away food, clothing, and even horses given to him by nobles. One story tells of a noble who gave Aidan a fine horse to ease his travels. Later that day, Aidan gave the horse to a beggar. When questioned, he responded, "What use is a horse if the man of God forgets the poor?" A new kind of power. Lindisfarne became more than a monastery. It was a symbol of a different kind of kingship. Under Oswald, the Northumbrian court was infused with Christian values. Justice was encouraged. charity was admired, learning was supported. But make no mistake, Northumbria was still a warrior kingdom. Oswald fought battles, dealt with rival kings, and ruled with authority. What changed was the model of leadership. The king was no longer simply the chief warlord, blessed by pagan priests, but rather a servant of a higher order, advised by bishops and guided by the Gospels. Oswald's court reflected this dual identity: sword and psalter, hall and cloister. The monastery's influence. Though modest in appearance, Lindisfarne quickly grew in influence. It attracted monks and novices from all over Britain and Ireland. It copied and preserved Latin manuscripts. It became a hub for training missionaries, many of whom later went to Mercia, Essex, and even continental Europe. It produced illuminated manuscripts, most famously the Lindisfarne Gospels, a masterpiece of early medieval art, created later in the 8th century by Eadfrith, but reflecting the legacy of Aidan's time. The monastery also served as a diplomatic bridge between the Celtic and Roman Christian traditions, which were growing more divergent in liturgical practices and ecclesiastical authority. Fragile peace. Under Oswald and Aidan, Christianity blossomed. But the peace was fragile. Pagan resistance still existed in parts of Northumbria. The Roman and Celtic churches were increasingly at odds over the date of Easter, the tonsure of monks, and other rites. Political rivalries between kingdoms like Mercia, Wessex, and Gwynedd threatened to erupt again. In 642, Oswald was killed in battle by Penda of Mercia, the same pagan warlord who had brought down Edwin. Once again, Northumbria was plunged into uncertainty. But unlike before, this time Christianity did not collapse. Why? Because Aidan remained. Because Lindisfarne endured. Because faith had taken root not just in kings, but in communities. The silent strength of the island. To the outside world, Lindisfarne was a place of prayer, quiet study, and humble living. But in reality, it was a spiritual engine, helping to turn northern England from a pagan land of warring tribes into a network of Christian kingdoms. And Aidan, never canonized by Rome in his lifetime, was honored by the people as a saint. After his death in 651, miracles were attributed to him. His relics were preserved. His name was remembered in monasteries from Durham to Melrose. But more than relics or miracles, Aidan left a way of being. To walk among the people, to teach with patience, to live simply, to serve humbly. It was this legacy, not dramatic sermons or royal decrees, that allowed the Christian faith to outlast kings and conquerors. So we end this first part of Lindisfarne's story with a question. What is more powerful, the sword that wins the kingdom, or the monk who quietly changes it from within? When King Oswald fell at the hands of Penda of Mercia in 642, the Christian kingdom of Northumbria stood once again on uncertain ground. The warrior king who had been both battlefield victor and spiritual patron was gone. But this time, the Christian faith he championed did not fall with him. Why? Because Lindisfarne endured. Because Bishop Aidan remained. Because monks and communities, quietly and steadily, had begun to change the spiritual fabric of the land. In this section, we explore how Aidan's mission outlived kings, how Lindisfarne became a spiritual and educational powerhouse, and how a generation of saints, men and women, alike grew from its teachings to shape the next chapters of Anglo-Saxon England. After Oswald, Aidan's quiet leadership. The death of Oswald could have spelled disaster. Yet, Aidan stayed at Lindisfarne and did not abandon the Northumbrians, even as power shifted and borders wavered. He continued, preaching in villages, training new monks, supporting the poor, acting as a moral advisor to new kings, including Oswiu, Oswald's brother. Aidan's influence went beyond ecclesiastical boundaries. He was increasingly seen as a symbol of continuity, a kind of moral compass during political turmoil. When the nobility wavered, the monastery stood firm. When courts changed, the island's teachings remained. A monastery that taught a kingdom. By the mid-7th century, Lindisfarne was no longer just a spiritual outpost. It had become a training center for future bishops and missionaries, a school of Latin, scripture, and hymnody, a refuge for noble youths seeking education and spiritual formation. Among its most important pupils was Cuthbert, a Northumbrian shepherd turned monk, who would later become one of the most revered figures in English Christianity. Lindisfarne fostered not only religious discipline, but also cultural sophistication. Its scribes copied manuscripts, its teachers spread literacy, and its monks brought learning to places where the written word had been largely forgotten since the Roman withdrawal. The island monastery became a beacon of learning in the Dark Ages. The rise of St. Cuthbert. One of the clearest examples of Lindisfarne's influence is the life of St. Cuthbert. Born around 630, for the same year Oswald I at Heavenfield, Cuthbert was raised during the years of Aidan's mission. As a young boy tending sheep, he had a vision of angels carrying a soul to heaven. The next day, he learned that Aidan had died that same night. He took it as a divine sign. Cuthbert joined Melrose Abbey, another center founded by Lindisfarne-trained monks, and quickly rose through its ranks. He was a traveling monk, known for visiting remote villages on foot, a healer and miracle worker, according to later accounts, an ascetic devoted to prayer and fasting. Eventually, he became prior of Lindisfarne, then bishop, and finally a hermit on the remote island of Inner Farne, where he sought solitude in his final years. When he died in 687, his body was said to be uncorrupted, a powerful sign of sanctity in medieval belief. His cult spread quickly. Women of the Lindisfarne legacy. The age of saints in Northumbria wasn't defined by men alone. From Lindisfarne and its circle of influence emerged some of the most influential women in the early English church, including Hilda of Whitby, a noblewoman who became abbess of Whitby Abbey, trained under the Celtic Christian tradition before adopting Roman customs, founded a double monastery, men and women, which became a center of learning, presided over the Synod of Whitby in 664, where Roman and Celtic practices were debated. Aelfled, daughter of King Oswiu and trained by Hilda, later abbess of Whitby, carrying forward the Lindisfarne tradition, corresponded with bishops and kings, influencing ecclesiastical policy. These women weren't merely pious figures, they were leaders, educators, and diplomatic actors in a period where faith and politics were deeply intertwined. The Synod of Whitby, a turning point. By the mid-600s, the differences between Celtic and Roman Christianity had become a point of tension. The date of Easter, the style of the monastic tonsure, haircut, authority of local bishops versus the Pope. In 664, King Oswiu convened the Synod of Whitby to decide the issue. The debate was passionate but civil. Bishop Calman of Lindisfarne defended the Celtic tradition. Wilfrid, a Northumbrian trained in Gaul and Italy, spoke for Roman customs. In the end, Oswiu sided with Rome. It was not a rejection of Lindisfarne, but rather an alignment with a wider Christian world. Lindisfarne monks like Calman withdrew to Ireland and Iona, but the island itself remained active, slowly adopting Roman practices over time. The decision unified the English Church, but also marked the end of the pure, Celtic phase of Lindisfarne's influence. The cultural legacy. Even as its customs changed, Lindisfarne's cultural power only grew. By the late 7th and early 8th centuries, the island produced some of the finest religious art in medieval Europe, chief among them the Lindisfarne Gospels, created by Eadfrith, Bishop of Lindisfarne, a richly illuminated Latin manuscript containing the four Gospels, combines Celtic knotwork, Anglo-Saxon iconography, and Mediterranean styles. Housed in a shrine to St. Cuthbert, this manuscript represents a spiritual fusion: Celtic roots, Roman orthodoxy, and English artistry. It is, in many ways, the visual embodiment of Lindisfarne's mission. Seed scattered far and wide, Lindisfarne trained monks and their successors spread across England and the continent. Willibrord and Boniface brought Christianity to Frisia and Germany. Missionaries from Lindisfarne-founded houses reached Essex, Mercia, and East Anglia. The practices of community prayer, monastic discipline, and lay education became standard across England. From a small tidal island, a generation of saints reshaped the land. Their approach was not based on fear, fire, or force. It was built on walking, listening, teaching, and living among the people. A question of permanence. As the 8th century progressed, Lindisfarne remained a vital spiritual center, but there were signs of looming danger. Political rivalries resumed. Mercia and Wessex grew in power. And from across the sea, a new threat stirred, one not yet felt, but soon to arrive with brutal clarity. Lindisfarne had survived kings and synods, cultural shifts, and theological disputes. But what happens to a place built on peace when violence once again returns to its shores? By the late 8th century, Lindisfarne stood as a symbol of Christian achievement in the Anglo-Saxon world. The once humble island monastery had become a beacon of learning, artistry, and spiritual life. Its saints were revered, its scribes respected, and its mission fulfilled far beyond its shores. But history is rarely kind to peace for long. In 793 AD, Lindisfarne was shattered by a sudden act of violence, a Viking raid. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for the monastery, but for all of Anglo-Saxon England. This final section explores the fall, survival, and legacy of Lindisfarne as it faced its greatest test, and asks what remains when even sacred places are no longer safe. The calm before the storm. Lindisfarne, by the 780s, was at the height of its cultural influence. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created by Bishop Eadfrith, represented one of the finest examples of insular art. Pilgrims came from across England to visit the shrine of St. Cuthbert. The monastery served as a mother house for other centers, including Durham, Whitby, and Jarrow. Lindisfarne monks, scribes, and missionaries played roles across the Frankish Empire and beyond. Its position on an exposed coast, accessible only at low tide, had once made it ideal for spiritual retreat. But now, that isolation became a vulnerability. Across the North Sea, a new force was rising. The Norsemen arrived. In 793, Scandinavian warriors, what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply called heathen men, landed at Lindisfarne. They came in sleek longships, silent until their oars hit the shallows. The Chronicle records, "In this year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, and those were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine soon followed, and shortly after in the same year, the harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island by rapine and slaughter. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. Monks were killed or enslaved. Treasures were stolen: crosses, gospel books, altar ornaments. The shrine of St. Cuthbert was desecrated. The monks who escaped fled inland, devastated. It was not only a physical attack, it was a psychological earthquake. A sacred space had been violated, its sanctity no shield against the axe. Why Lindisfarne? Historians still ask, Why was Lindisfarne targeted first? Several reasons are likely. Wealth, though monastic, Lindisfarne held gold, silver, and relics of value. Visibility. Its location on the coast made it easily spotted from sea. Lack of defense. No walls, no garrisons, monasteries were soft targets. Symbolism. The Vikings may not have cared about Christian symbolism, but to English Christians, the assault was existential. It is probable that the Vikings did not know what Lindisfarne was, exactly not at first, but the impact of the raid went far beyond its physical destruction. It signaled that no place, however holy, was safe. Flight and preservation. In the wake of the raid, the surviving monks fled, taking with them their most precious relic, the body of St. Cuthbert. They began a long, nomadic journey, carrying the saint's coffin from place to place. Chester-le-Street, Norham, Ripon, eventually to Durham, where a new shrine was built. This journey, lasting over a century, became a sacred migration, part of English ecclesiastical memory. The monks also preserved the Lindisfarne Gospels, Cuthbert's relics, including his incorrupt body and his personal items, oral traditions, and records of the monastery's history. Thus, even in exile, Lindisfarne's legacy lived on. A new kind of monastery. Eventually, a monastic presence did return to Lindisfarne, but the age of isolated, defenseless communities was over. Later in the 9th and 10th centuries, fortified monasteries became the norm. Durham Cathedral, built over Cuthbert's new shrine, became the spiritual successor to Lindisfarne. Monasteries adapted to new threats, building walls and towers, cooperating with kings and military leaders for protection. Monks became not only scribes and priests, but landlords, administrators, and power brokers. The spiritual purity of Aidan's barefoot ministry did not disappear, but it had to be adapted to new political realities. The quiet flame of Lindisfarne was still there, but it flickered behind battlements. Historical legacy. Despite the tragedy of 793, the monastery's impact endured. The Lindisfarne Gospels survive to this day, preserved in the British Library. St. Cuthbert remains a central figure in English Christian heritage. The syncretic style of Lindisfarne, fusing Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and Mediterranean traditions, shaped English art for generations. The itinerant style of Aidan's and Cuthbert's ministry influenced later missionary work, including in Scandinavia itself. Ironically, some of the descendants of Viking raiders would later become Christian kings and benefactors of English churches. What began in fire ended in conversion. Lindisfarne today. Modern Lindisfarne remains a place of pilgrimage. The tidal causeway, still navigable at low tide, leads visitors into a place unlike anywhere else. Ruins of the later medieval priory. A small, living community. Sites associated with Aidan and Cuthbert. Windswept grasslands, seabird calls, and silence. It is not a grand sight. There are no golden relics, no towering cathedrals. But perhaps that's the point. Lindisfarne's story was never about might, it was about faith lived simply, in huts and chapels, among the people. A final reflection. The fall of Lindisfarne reminds us of history's hard truths. Even the most sacred spaces are not immune to violence. Even the most peaceful communities must adapt to survive. And even in destruction, legacy can endure. Aidan could not have imagined longships on the shore, nor could Eadfrith as he illuminated the Gospels, but their work, preserved through hardship, became the foundation of English Christianity. So we close with this question. When your world is washed away by the tide, what truths remain that no axe can destroy?